to another reflection on the Daily Vedantic. The reflection for today is a very simple, short, succinct one. That is a correction of a misnomer about Eastern philosophy. The Vedas, the four Vedas, which are the oldest philosophical texts in the world, and in terms of living continuous study, Advaita Vedanta, which this podcast expounds upon on a daily basis. Advaita Vedanta is the oldest philosophy known to man. These two things, the Vedas and the philosophy of Advaita Vedanta, this is historically interesting, not just because of the fact that it's so ancient. And these concepts not only predate things like Western philosophy, pre-Socratic philosophers, Socratic philosophers. Socrates himself was in many ways drawing on very similar ideas. It's unclear exactly if there was any overlap. The Silk Road absolutely existed between Greece and India. Socrates' hero, Pythagoras, who lived about 20 years before Socrates, it's rumored to have spent up to a decade in India. And again, the trade routes connecting them two were well established by this point. But the concept of the allegory of the cave, perfect example that is so similar to the concepts of Advaita Vedanta. And these concepts might predate Advaita Vedanta. I'm not even saying Advaita Vedanta came across these. But this perennial philosophy, as Aldous Huxley called it, this philosophy that comes through all of these major traditions, all of these great titans of questioning, asking very similar questions. Who are we? Who am I? Obviously, the great quote of the unexamined life is not worth living, asking these questions. Coming up with very similar answers. Asking similar questions, coming up with similar answers. You could even, and I tell people to do this all the time, I did it as a little breakfast trick with a group this morning. Type into ChatGPT, knowing everything you know about science, philosophy, and religion. Knowing everything you know about science, philosophy, and religion. Act as if you are an expert on these topics and tell me what is the most likely explanation of the universe today. Ask it that question, and then it'll give you a version of monism, monistic idealism, of idealistic monism, of non-duality, of process theory, integrative theory. These are kind of modern words that you can then say is Advaita Vedanta, a version of this. We did it this morning, and the first person that did it on their phone said, yes, this is Advaita Vedanta is an elegant ancient description and articulation of this viewpoint. That co-signing of the world's most dynamic compendium of human knowledge, of ChatGPT or any AI tool, is radically just insightful. It just wouldn't exist 5 years ago. 10 years ago, maybe you'd ask Google, you'd be presented with a couple websites that may have broached this subject before. Maybe you would have a uncle or a brother that studied, or you yourself studied philosophy, where you could try to triangulate the narrow edge of the philosophy you were exposed to. But triangulating nearly all of human knowledge to ask such a question is, quite frankly, nuts. And I recommend that anybody go and do that. This word monism is interesting. It's more of a Western word for non-duality, monism being oneness. Non-duality, the reason that it's called Advaita Vedanta, non-dual, end of knowledge, Advaita means non-dual, is that oneness, and this is, I love Eastern philosophers because they're so damn precise with their words, because they've got thousands of generations to refine the precision with each word. Oneness is used. It's used within this philosophy, but the more precise word that's used more often is non-dual, not two. Why is that? Well, oneness is 95% there. This is all oneness, a monistic universe, oneness. And Monism, like monolithic kind of oneness. But monism and oneness implies there's a border. When something is all one, it's 95% there, but a subtle implication that there's a border versus not two. Everything is not two. It's non-dual. That there is an interconnection with everything and there is no border. It's infinite. As we seem to understand in our modern science that the universe is not only infinite but also expanding. The word Brahman, which is seen as the supreme, the divine, the underlying aspect of this oneness, of this non-duality within the philosophy of Vedanta. Brahman, which this philosophy says, that thou art. You are Brahman. Atman is Brahman. That's one of the Mahavakyas, one of the four great phrases of this ancient philosophy. The Atman is Brahman. The individual soul, the individual essence is the cosmic essence. That's how it's often defined. Atman is Brahman. But Brahman, technically speaking, the literal translation is the vast, the expanse, the infinite that is also expanding, very similar to how we describe the universe today. The misconception of Eastern philosophy that then you have Hinduism about 1,000 years later gets built on top of the Vedas, on top of Vedanta as a crystallized, succinct philosophy. You have a lot of ritualization built on top. Then you have a proliferation of symbolic deities, lowercase g gods. Then you have, as the adage goes, Buddhism, which is Hinduism made for export as it leaves India and enters China. Then you have derivations like Zen, leaving China and entering Japan. You follow that back, Zen, Buddhism, Hinduism, the Vedas. The philosophy of the end of the Vedas, the culmination of the Vedas, which is Vedanta, which means end of the Vedas. And this philosophy that needs to be rescued every few hundred years, returned back to its succinct, concise, straightforward, non-woo-woo, no leaps of faith, no rituals, no shoulds, no should-nots, concise, crystallized philosophy. It's what Vedanta treatise that I'm always pointing to. It's on the bookshelf there. It's on my desk over there. That I'm always pointing to. Vedanta treatise. It's the beginning to end of this philosophy in a succinct, straightforward, plain English way. And that is the history of this philosophy. I've touched on this in previous episodes, but I've never touched on why we have so many misconceptions. One of the main reasons we have major misconceptions about Eastern philosophy, especially around anything to do with the Vedas, Vedanta, Hinduism, and seeing it as a polytheistic religion, is in large part due to the British Empire. You see, we've only had the Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, the most famous poem on the planet. 1 billion copies sold each year. The oftentimes simplified to the Bible of Hinduism. That text, the Gita, was only translated into English 200 years ago. We've had Western philosophy for 10 times longer than we've had access to the tenets, the principles, or the text of something like the Bhagavad Gita. The heart of it's the Gita, a 30-minute conversation, short 700-verse poem. That is the whole philosophy of Vedanta. So the access to Eastern philosophy is so nascent, so young. And the people that had the control of how this philosophy was talked about, how it was translated, described, proliferated in the West, was primarily through the British Empire. And the British Empire had a very, very serious problem. They needed to colonize and control perhaps the most resourceful land area in the world, India. There's this old phrase that all of Rome's gold went to India for its spices. America itself was founded in an attempt to find a trade route to India for the spices. The spices that India has, as well as all of the other resources. I mean, the climate is so perfect It's like a Costa Rica that's 1,000 times the size. You throw mango seeds in the ground and boom, a month later you got a mango tree. So resourceful, such a bountiful climate. And the British islands are not known for their natural resources. Part of the way to control them was to infantilize their philosophy. Introduce them to the order, the bureaucracy, the power, the might of the British Empire, the British way of thinking, the British religion, and again, infantilize the domestic philosophy of India, saying, if you follow us, you can have a lot more prosperity. You might have a whole lot of problems and stress. And, the UK, I think it's 90% of youths between 15 and 30 in the UK that were surveyed about 2 years ago said they do not have a purpose in life. So you might get some of that too. But look at this three-piece suit. Look at this civilized approach. Look at this prosperity. And for 150 out of the last 200 years, not only did that viewpoint rule, but so did the British until 1947. This infantilization included things like the Western world receiving about 2 weeks of education around Hinduism, thinking it's a polytheistic religion. It's actually the first monotheistic religion, the world's first monotheistic religion, where the monotheism, in a dualistic sense, is Brahman, the supreme deity, the rest being symbols, lowercase g, gods, and there are 8,000, probably many more, versions of Hinduism. So there are some that see the lowercase g gods as supreme deities. There are some that worship one god over another. But within the philosophy of Hinduism, going back 3, 4, 5,000 years, you have this continuous thread, continuous interpretation in the midst of many other interpretations, but a continuous interpretation of monotheism. But even more, you have the earliest human ideas around monism, around oneness. Monotheism, and the difference is monotheism is one God. So there are people, there's one God. And in the West, we talk about theology a lot. We talk about monotheism. We talk about polytheism. We don't even realize there's a third category called non-theism. But the difference between monotheism, and I promise I will be done with the jargon here in a sec. Monotheism, one God, that is revered. And monism is there is no external God to revere. Monism, academically, is often referred to as non-theism, where there is no, it's not atheism, and it's not theism. There is no external God to revere, because it is all one. There is no such thing as an exterior. There is no such thing as separateness. Monism, again, is a more academic term for non-duality. Non-duality, Advaita Vedanta, the Stanford Encyclopedia on Philosophies, categorizes Advaita Vedanta as non-theistic. Same for Buddhism. And a very similar misconception exists in a Western view of Buddhism. Buddha is not a god. There is a view in the West that Buddha is God for the Buddhists. For some interpretations within the large, massive array of Buddhistic traditions, that might be the case. But that whole philosophy is actually built on a very strong articulation of there being no God, of there being anatma, no self, of there being nothing in the midst of a perceived something. But within these layers of misconceptions, within these layers upon layers of misconceptions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Vedanta, in the midst of these layers, all built, reinforced, for better or worse, much of which for the West in the last 200 years, within these layers, cracks are beginning to appear. The light is starting to shine through. Is it wild ritualization and God's everywhere, or is it symbolism pointing to God everywhere? Is it rituals for anything and everything out there? Or is it a philosophy based on the internal perspective of what is in here? Is it a far cry and foreign exotic proclamations of that thou art? It seems so different than what we hear in the West. Or is it quite similar to the original Greek? We don't know what Christ said in his original Aramaic, but in the original Greek, is it quite similar to the kingdom of heaven is within you? Is it quite similar to him praying half a dozen times in the prayer of the Last Supper that we recognize our oneness with him like the oneness he recognized with the Father? Praying for us to recognize our oneness with each other. 6 times he asked for that in the prayer of the Last Supper. This is, for Christians, God praying and asking us, praying to us to receive a message of oneness. I've never heard a sermon on the pulpit. Growing up Roman Catholic, never heard a sermon on the pulpit about the oneness he prays for. 6 times in the prayer of the Last Supper. Is it so different? Or when we knock off the layers of misinterpretation, deliberate or not, when we knock off those layers, is the perennial philosophy coming through in all of these major traditions? Is one message being repeated and hammered on by sage after sage? Or as the Rig Veda says, truth is one, sages call it by many names. Within Jewish Kabbalism, Islamic Sufism, Christian mysticism, Advaita Vedanta, Dzogchen Buddhism, is there not just a rhyme between them? Is there not just many messages that seem to conflict, but is there just one said in different ways? That is today's reflection on the Daily Vedantic. We'll see you next time.